Hello and welcome to Newsline. I'm Rosa Ritchie.
And I'm Dom Hennequin. On the program today, state premiers of both Victoria and New South Wales come under close scrutiny. A COVID-19 outbreak in regional Victoria destabilises the city of Shepparton. We'll take a look at some of the teething problems experienced by newly opened Victorian schools. And Deakin University epidemiologist Catherine Bennett joins us live to discuss contact tracing in Victoria.
In a tech update, we'll hear about Apple's newly released iPhone 12. We'll also have updates across sports, finance and weather. Now to today's headlines.
Victoria has reported 7 new coronavirus cases overnight and 5 deaths. 4 of those cases are in Melbourne, while 3 are in northern Victoria in the town of Shepparton and are linked to the Chadstone cluster. A Melbourne resident who spawned a COVID cluster in Kilmore did not reveal he also travelled to Shepparton. Premier Daniel Andrews says that he's been referred to Victoria Police.
You don't get in trouble if you tell the full story. You potentially do get into trouble if you don't.
And we'll take a closer look at the Shepparton outbreak with our reporter, Neve Walton, later in the program.
A no-confidence motion against Premier Daniel Andrews, moved by the Liberal National Coalition last night, has failed, with 23 votes for and 44 votes against. But the Premier's decision-making is also being criticised by Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, who has publicly requested Victorian businesses be allowed to open. In response, Andrews says the Prime Minister did not raise any of the same concerns in a phone call with this morning. He says Mr. Frydenberg is entitled to his opinion, but the Victorian government will take the advice of public health experts ahead of an announcement on Sunday.
New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian says she's overwhelmed and sustained by public support. It comes after she admitted to having been in a 5-year relationship with former MP Daryl Maguire, who's being investigated by the state's Independent Commission Against Corruption. Ms Berejiklian says Mr Maguire obviously fooled a lot of people because he was clearly conducting activities he shouldn't have and many people were not aware of.
To education, singing, brass and woodwind instruments are banned in group music classes in all Victorian schools for Term 4. This announcement has outraged music teachers, with some industry bodies arguing there are no reported incidences of COVID-19 transmission in music classes in Australia. A spokesperson for the Department of Health and Human Services says updated advice will allow schools in regional Victoria to conduct individual tuition or have classes of 10 or fewer students, outdoors and with physical distancing. A solution for metropolitan schools is also being explored.
Curtin University is assessing the damage after a 23-year-old worker died and 2 others were injured when a glass roof collapsed. Emergency services were called yesterday after the roof gave way at a building on the edge of the campus. 2 workers were on the roof at the time, with both men falling nearly 20 metres to the ground. It's not yet known what caused the roof to give way.
4 charges against Melbourne man Richard Pouzet have been thrown out in the Magistrates Court due to insufficient evidence. The Porsche driver is accused of filming a dying police officer after a fatal crash. He is no longer charged with failing to render assistance after an accident, destruction of evidence, and 2 counts of attempting to pervert the course of justice. However, he is still set to face 12 charges, including the rare offence of outraging public decency.
And the trial of an antibody drug recently administered to the US President Donald Trump has been paused since Tuesday because of a safety concern. The drug being developed by pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly and Co. has been described as a COVID-19 cure in a video posted by the US president last week. The news comes one day after pharmaceutical giant Johnson & Johnson announced it will pause a high-profile coronavirus vaccine trial because a volunteer fell ill. It remains unclear whether the person was given the vaccine or a placebo.
Now to our first story. While many will celebrate a return to COVID normal, in Melbourne there is concern that people with disabilities will still be locked out. Advocates ask that Melbourne's music and arts scene take lessons from coronavirus in a new normal for a more accessible city. Elsie Lange has the story.
For people with physical disabilities, being locked out of Melbourne's concerts and nightlife isn't new. The city's infrastructure, despite massive leaps in recent years, still lacks a lot of accessibility. And when COVID forced Melbourne's music and arts scene online, people with physical disabilities were finally able to access areas and places they might not have been able to go to before. Erin Kian, a queer trans writer, performer and podcast maker, uses a wheelchair to aid his chronic illness.
Usually if there is a musician or group I'm interested in watching perform, I have to get in touch with the venue they're performing at and say, hey, before I was a wheelchair user, it was, I'm not good with stairs, but now it's, I need wheelchair access. Also things like, pre-wheelchair, I need seating.
As an avid campaigner for greater physical accessibility in Melbourne's music and arts scene, Erin has found the online world of COVID-19 to be more accessible to disabled audiences and performers.
I've got some friends as well who have been able to attend things for the first time in a decade because we've been able to start live streaming. And it's really interesting and a little frustrating because disabled people have been asking for this for a really, really, really long time.
Since it's been proven that the arts world can exist online, there are hopes these lessons will be taken into the future.
Post-COVID, I do hope that we keep the online gigs going. They are wonderfully accessible for so many people, and not just people with disabilities. It also works for parents who have kids who can't necessarily go out and afford a babysitter and whatnot. They can still enjoy some live music from the comfort of their own home. So I think a mix of the two would be really nice.
Disability access campaigners are hoping that Melbourne's music and arts scene can work towards a more inclusive future. I'm Elsie Lange, reporting for RMIT Newsline.
To international news now, and coronavirus restrictions have been reintroduced in many countries across Europe. The Czech Republic is imposing a 3-week partial lockdown after their infection rate rose to over 100,000. Stephanie Barker joins us now. And Steph, what measures have the Czech Republic introduced?
Thanks, Dom. So the Czech Republic will now be closing schools, bars and clubs. They will remain closed until the 3rd of November, with restaurants restricted to deliveries and takeaways. University dorms will also be closed, and all school lessons will continue at home via the internet. Kindergartens will be open, and some exceptions will be made for the children of critical carers. Masks are already being worn in shops, but they will be also extended to mandatory use on public transport, including at public transport stations. And the maximum group gathering numbers will be 6 people, both indoors and outdoors.
Right. So where else have measures been reintroduced?
There has been a 4-week partial lockdown also reintroduced in the Netherlands. That will see bars, restaurants, terraces and cannabis cafes closed. It has also restricted grocery stores from selling alcohol after 8 p.m. There's speculation that measures will also be reintroduced in France after hospitals in Paris reported that up to 90% of their intensive care beds could be filled by the end of next week.
Wow, that's a big number. All right, to the US now, and Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett has finished the second day of her Senate confirmation hearing. Coney Barrett was vague about her stance on many issues, saying she had no agenda other than to stick to the rule of law.
Courts have a vital responsibility to the rule of law, which is critical to a free society. But courts are not designed to solve every problem or right every wrong in our public life. The policy decisions and value judgments of government must be made by the political branches, elected by and accountable to the people. The public should not expect courts to do so, and courts should not try.
So Coney Barrett was evasive about some topics. Steph, what were some of the issues that she did not address?
So she refused to answer questions on abortion, healthcare, and LGBTIQ rights, which were key points of discussion because of the Republican Party's generally quite strong stance on these issues. She has said that she has no agenda and will stick to the rules of the law, but that's despite, again, Trump and the Republican Party having quite a strong stance on these issues, so she hasn't commented or addressed how they will be handled. If she passes the committee hearing, the full Senate will vote to confirm or reject her for a lifelong place on the top US court.
All right. Thanks for that, Steph. We're heading to a short break now. Coming up, a leading epidemiologist on what she believes is wrong with Victoria's COVID tracing system. And how are students organising protests under lockdown? Stay with us. It's Newsline.
Hello and welcome back. The federal government has gone quiet on COVID Safe, the digital contact tracing app released in April. The app was labelled a failure, but new reports now show the government is spending more money on the app. Nicholas Zumboulis has the story.
The COVID Safe app was described by Prime Minister Scott Morrison as the ticket to easing restrictions, but After major privacy concerns and issues with its effectiveness, the government has now doubled spending on the app to $5 million.
It's going to be expensive to continue to maintain running something like this. And the question, I suppose, is, do we think it's doing enough of what we need it to do in order to warrant the type of public expenditure that's being made on a tool like this?
Only 56% of Victorians have the COVID Safe app on their phone, according to a Roy Morgan poll. Privacy groups say the government needs to be more transparent about how Australians are using the app.
The downloads, I think, is a deliberately unhelpful high number. There's plenty of people do that with curiosity, but if it turns out it doesn't work, or it crashes their phone, or they just get bored with it, or they're no longer persuaded by the proportionality of the intrusion, they don't do it. So I think the actual daily use is the measure.
The Prime Minister described the app as protection against coronavirus.
I would liken it to the fact that if you want to go outside, when the sun's shining, you've got to put sunscreen on.
But a lack of transparency means we don't know how effective the app has actually been.
How many is it a day? How long is it that people run it for? Or how long between times when they run it? Those sorts of things would be very helpful. And the other question is, if you don't do that, why not?
Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews says the app will be more useful once the community is out of lockdown, but until more data is released, we'll have to take the government's word for it. I'm Nicholas Zamboulis, reporting for RMIT Newsline.
We'll be hearing more on contact tracing shortly as we speak to Deakin University epidemiologist Catherine Bennett. And now to news in Australia. Victoria reported 7 COVID cases today, 3 linked to the Shepparton outbreak. Reporter Neve Walton joins us. Neve, what information have we been given about testing?
So, as usual, Dan Andrews spoke earlier today about COVID-19 at the press conference. The Department of Health are encouraging all people in Shepparton areas to come forward for testing, even if they are asymptomatic. The DHS has also released a list of places that positive cases have turned up, and these include a Bunnings, a tyre shop, and a hairdresser's. These cases have been confirmed to be linked to previous clusters earlier in the week. Let's see what Dan Andrews has to say earlier today.
There are infections in Shepparton today that we know of, and there's almost certainly going to be more, that were all completely preventable if this individual had told the full story.
For now, Dan Andrews is encouraging people to come forward for testing as quickly as they can. The rest of Victoria will be waiting for the Sunday update to restrictions.
I'm sure they will. Moving to New South Wales, Premier Gladys Berejiklian has been weathering a storm after admitting she was in a secret 5-year relationship with disgraced former MP Daryl Maguire. Neve, remind us how this story initially broke.
Yes, so we saw this information come out at the Independent Commission Against Corruption hearing. Mr Maguire was asked to leave politics in 2018. Ms Berejiklian told the Commission about her relationship with Mr Maguire on Monday, stating that they had been in a relationship between 2015 and the August of this year. Mr Maguire will be speaking at the hearing for the rest of the week, so more information is to come.
The story has shaken New South Wales politics to the core, and many opposition figures have called for her to step down. What is the fallout so far for Ms Berejiklian?
Yes, so the opposition did put forward for a vote of no confidence. It was delayed this afternoon because of question time, and it is not clear whether it will go through because of Labor's don't have a majority in the lower house. But Prime Minister Scott Morrison did come out earlier yesterday with his vote of confidence for Ms Berejiklian.
Thank you, Neve. We'll be heading to a short break. Coming up in a few minutes, we'll hear from Deakin epidemiologist Catherine Bennett on how Victoria's COVID tracing system could be improved. And we hear all about the new iPhone 12 with RMIT representative Steph Barker. Stay with us. Welcome back to Newsline. Victoria's coronavirus restrictions haven't stopped the School Strike for Climate movement from going ahead with its global day of action this year. Hundreds of students around the nation have gathered online and in COVID-safe groups to protest against the federal government's backing of the gas industry. Caitlin Cassidy reports.
Last year, the School Strike for Climate protests attracted 300,000 Australians who took to the streets armed with signs and rallying cries.
In the year of a pandemic, though, the Global Day of Action was always going to look a little bit different. But the students' message remained loud and clear: for the federal government to fund their future, not the gas industry.
We're trying to show them that gas is not a sustainable future. It can't be our transition fuel, and we need to go straight to solar and wind power.
Masks and physical distancing, part and parcel of living in 2020, were all on display this year. And rather than sheer crowd numbers, the event was planned around small COVID-safe actions spread across states and territories. Researchers say the school strikers are leading the way in demonstrating how protests might look in the future.
This is not something that's filtered and curated by media outlets. These are everyday people just broadcasting these everyday situations and drawing attention to their cause. It compels this sense of action on behalf of audiences or people who see such stories and such images when their own scope to have impact on these discussions might be limited.
More than 500 physical and online actions went ahead around the nation, from Alice Springs to Hobart. The day kicked off with a virtual protest in the ACT, with the lawns of Parliament House covered with placards calling for a climate-led COVID-19 recovery. In Melbourne, protesters gathered online for a live Q&A and Instagram concert following COVID-safe physical gatherings in other states and territories. School strikers say their message isn't dampened by going virtual.
I hope to see coming out of COVID that everyone has learnt how to change their day-to-day lives, how to take action and how to live differently. And we can do the exact same with climate-related things. And we've seen that students are making progress. We've already started having these protests, and it's only going to get bigger.
It's been actually this pandemic that's made me a little bit more hopeful and a little bit more optimistic about the role of digital media in activist movements and political engagement, mainly because the pandemic has forced people to be so immobile, but at the same time being so exposed to what's going on elsewhere in the world.
For now, the steps of Victoria's Parliament House, once densely packed with protesters, remains empty. But the school strikers will return soon enough, buoyed by the opportunity of how our post-pandemic world might look. Caitlin Cassidy, RMIT, Melbourne.
Victoria's contact tracing system has faced criticism for being inefficient in comparison with New South Wales for months now. But the Victorian Premier and Chief Health Officer insist it's improved. Yet Deakin University Head of Epidemiology, Catherine Bennett, says there are key features that underpin the two states' systems that are different and will affect how quickly we can open up. Professor Bennett joins me now. Thanks for joining me. Professor Bennett, you've described Victoria's previous contract tracing effort as like building an airplane while flying. So how has it improved?
The big difference between Victoria's system and New South Wales has been that it's a centralised system, and as our second wave took off and our numbers of cases escalated very quickly, it was difficult to build that surge capacity within state. So in fact, not only was it a centralised system, but we had people helping with contact tracing who were phoning in from other states to try and build that capacity. And when we had early on in the outbreak, the public housing outbreaks that became more complicated because we had people who, for those people, being in isolation in a tower is very different from someone on a block of land. So it meant that there had to be better community engagement, and the system wasn't really well set up for that, particularly when you had this scaling up that made it quite remote from the communities you're working with. So that was something that's really changed. It's been building that localised response, a regional response in Victoria, but also within Metro Melbourne, starting to build those local public health teams as well. So that's been a fundamental shift compared to New South Wales, which already has a structure a bit like that. You know, this was actually moving to that structure during the pandemic.
So going into New South Wales and our system, what are the other differences there, and how have our numbers made it difficult to kind of scale up or open up quicker?
Yeah, it's very hard to compare New South Wales to Victoria over the second wave because they really had a heads up and were on top of those early cases very quickly. And so they were able to really do the kind of contact tracing we're now doing with our numbers low. They could do that from the start. And that's what always kept their case numbers in check as they worked very hard to try and get ahead of the virus. It hasn't work completely because they're still chasing the virus in the community, but it stopped it hitting those large workplaces and starting to accelerate and turning into a full wave. So that's pretty much where we are now in Victoria, but it's still hard to compare the two because your outbreaks are so different. We've just had the Chadstone complex multi-node outbreak. So that then makes it quite difficult because what's happening in New South Wales is different to what's happening in Melbourne, just as one outbreak in Melbourne is different to the next.
But you do point in your article today in the conversation to recent cases in Kilmore as proof that our new contact tracing system is working. So can it handle us opening up soon?
Yeah, so the whole idea in having these fewer cases where you do this much more proactive case contact and their contacts, chasing all those people up at the one time as soon as you possibly can to try and ask them into isolation. It's your best chance to get someone in that, if they have already passed it on to their contact or their contacts, that they're already in isolation before they're infectious. And that's how you stop the virus from spreading. So it absolutely worked in Kilmore. And if you can respond that quickly, it means your outbreak response is less dependent on the number of contacts the individuals have because you've got them into isolation quickly and you don't have to follow up all their contacts in that next round of transmission. So it's actually a really good system to allow you to have a focused lockdown, if you like, on the people that matter around those cases, those clusters, but not keep imposing lockdowns on the wider community. And that's what they're trialling now and working really well, and that will help us move out of lockdown in a safer way.
A bit of hope there. All right, Professor Catherine Bennett from Deakin University, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Dom.
Tech giant Apple has unveiled the highly anticipated new iPhone 12, the first product from the company that will be compatible with 5G networks. Reporter Stephanie Barker joins me now to discuss the new technology. Steph, how is 5G technology different to 4G?
So, Rosa, 5G is the fifth generation of mobile technology. It's faster, more responsive, and it uses less power than its predecessor 4G.
Okay, and many companies have already rolled out phones that use 5G technology. Have these been successful so far?
They have been successful. 5G has been rolled out by companies including Samsung, Huawei, OnePlus and Google, and it's been really successful around the world, particularly in South Korea, Germany, the UK and the United States.
And what are the benefits of using 5G as opposed to 4G? Why do we need to upgrade?
Well, Rosa, theoretically, 5G can reach speeds 20 times faster than 4G can. That's because 5G can send and receive data at a much higher speed, it can reduce lag on things like video calls and gaming, as well as allowing more users to concentrate in particular spaces online with less congestion.
There have been a lot of conspiracy theories about 5G. I must confess that's most of what I've heard about the network myself. Are there any new security considerations to take into account when using 5G?
Rosa, there are a number of security concerns with 5G at this stage because obviously also it is a very new technology. Because 5G will increase network traffic, previous security systems won't necessarily be able to keep up with that increased demand, and so they may fall down in terms of security. Manufacturers are also not often that concerned about security in terms of personal devices, and that can lead to vulnerabilities, particularly on personal handsets.
So we're talking tech security issues, not health security issues. That's good to know. Thanks, Steph.
Thanks, Rosa.
No worries. Time for another quick break. When we come back, Casper McLeod will be here to tell us about the best stories of 2020, including a piece on how one group in the US is taking the fight against misinformation into their own hands, and why the coffee industry is in crisis. We'll see you shortly.
Like many other industries, journalists have been forced to adapt in new ways in order to accommodate reporting in a pandemic. We've selected a list of the top pieces of journalism in 2020, which we will be celebrating across the week. Joining me today are Jeremy Gann and Tom Pezes. First up, Jeremy, you've picked a story about the crystal industry, something we don't hear a lot about. Can you tell me why you think it's the best story of the year?
Yeah, so this article does a few things for me. It does one of my favorite things in journalism, which is tell a story about weird and absurd and left field topics, and especially this article takes a very interesting angle to it. Not only that, but it also goes really in depth into its topic, which is something I quite enjoy.
And you're a street photographer, aren't you? What did you think
Yep.
of the photos?
I thought they were quite disappointing, especially for an amazing feature story like this. It barely did anything to support the text, and it's quite unfortunate because in today's landscape of journalism and our increasing visual storytelling techniques, a lot of mediocre photographs are being supported with just amazing articles. Meanwhile, the photographs are just kind of mediocre. Yeah, it's quite unfortunate, really.
Indeed. Now, the story centers on the growing popularity of healing crystals, a big part of the wellness craze, as the article says. Can you give us a rundown on the story?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, the article is all about crystals and how it actually gets to its consumers. We are taken through the industry chain, and we see the process of how it gets from the miners in holes to the refiners and then to the consumers, and we also see how how the miners are being exploited in Madagascar. It also discusses the rise of alternative medicine, and that's big quote unquotes there, alternative medicine, and it just kind of deconstructs everything. Yeah.
Speaking of alternative medicine, how did that help in the rise in the popularity of these healing crystals?
Yeah, so recently there has been this increase in the belief of alternative science, once again, huge quote unquotes. A good example is the company Goop, which was launched by Gwyneth Paltrow. Is a pretty good example of a kind of like a group which is currently peddling this kind of pseudoscience, which honestly is quite absurd because there's this belief among them that these crystals can give some sort of ambient energy. It's very odd. It's very weird. It's quite absurd, really. Yeah.
Now, while these crystals seem to have some sort of ambient energy, as you quoted, they're a lot more risky to the health of their miners. Now, what do you think the international response would be if they knew about the human costs of these crystals?
I think the world already knows the costs of these conditions, which is the horrible conditions which the miners has to work in. I mean, there's no robust regulations on the market to prevent exploitation of the miners. And in the end, it's really up to the consumers if they would pay more for ethically sourced crystals. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy. A powerful and thought-provoking story indeed, making us consider the history of the items we buy.
Yeah, thanks, Casper. So let's move on to the story you looked at on online misinformation during the U.S. election. So can you talk me through the group who's trying to tackle the issue?
Sure, Jeremy. They call themselves the Real Facebook Oversight Board. The reason why they call themselves that is because Facebook just over a year ago said that they would set up their own independent oversight board, and they are yet to do that. And so this Real Facebook Oversight Board, as they call themselves, they are made up by members of various professions, including ex-Facebook employees, and they are just sick and tired of waiting for Facebook to do what they said that they were going to do a long time ago.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, has Facebook and other social media giants, have they been criticized heavily for allowing mis and disinformation to spread quite unchecked? And has this group managed to influence much change?
Absolutely. Facebook and the other social media platforms have faced a lot of criticism for the spread of misinformation and disinformation on their platforms. What's really interesting is that this particular group has actually gotten change implemented. They actually got Facebook to start to take down news that delegitimizes the US election, which is a pretty big deal. After that got announced by Facebook, Vice News reported that Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, then said on social media, Facebook must enforce its own policies and actually remove posts inciting violence. So that's the next step for this group.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And now, onto a break.
Welcome back to Newsline. With me is Tom to discuss a story about a global crisis affecting the world of coffee. In particular, we will look at the impact of climate change and the resulting economic impact on coffee exporters. But first, Tom, what is the global coffee crisis? Can you just explain what that is, please?
Sure thing. So I think first, before we're going to talk about the article, we need to understand a little bit about the coffee plant. It's a really fickle thing. It prefers temperatures between 18 and 21 degrees Celsius. It needs a lot of rain, but it also needs a 3-month dry season, warm days, cool nights. It grows best at specific altitudes. So what we see here is rising temperatures have reduced the amount of land suitable for cultivation. And as a result of that, market instability has really started to develop. So this means that farmers are lacking the agency to invest in solutions which might help them combat the changing climate, especially since the falling through of the International Coffee Agreement in the 1980s, along with the agreed price minimum. Now a lot of farmers in Colombia and around the world are barely breaking even. And that means that they really struggle to innovate. Additionally, with no export consensus, it really means that the market share and the volatility of prices is severely affecting the way in which these producers are able to get their product international.
A recent study estimates that by 2050, the amount of land that can sustain coffee cultivation will be reduced by 50%. And it's not just cultivated coffee. Another study estimates that 60% of wild coffee species could be at the risk of extinction because of climate change. Some of these are used to breed more resistant varieties of Arabica, which makes them critical to sustaining coffee production. That's not only bad news for the plant, but also for those who have relied on the coffee industry for generations.
So, to come back to the video for a moment, it's focusing primarily on Colombia, one of the most popular countries in terms of coffee. What is the nature of the impact we are seeing there?
Well, Casper, like most cases regarding coffee production, the Colombian coffee industry is largely composed of landholder farmers, that is, individual farming operations who have a piece of land from which they produce their coffee. This is a historical shift from the colonial plantations of the past. Following nationalization in the 1930s and the redistribution of that land, farmers in Colombia found themselves in a pretty good economic position, especially up to the latter half of the 20th century. But now, higher costs in maintenance due to the environmental factors which are at play mean that coffee produced in Southeast Asia and countries like Vietnam and Indonesia have really cornered the market share, being that they're cheaper to produce and cheaper to sell. And that means less money coming into farmers, again granting them less agency to be able to adapt to this changing environment. It's even led to a return to growing subsistence crops for their economic viability, which really hasn't been seen since the colonial era and the period just following that. This shows that the current situation is really unsustainable, and it's led to many farmers not being able to get by.
Globally, this industry is worth over 20 billion US dollars. What kind of economic impact have we seen thus far?
So far, the impact that we've been seeing has mainly been on producers. Because of the cyclical nature of the supply and demand dynamic, however, it's not unlikely that we might see a price hike in the future. To be honest, it's certainly a lens that we can see the real tangible impact of climate change and the way that it relates to our day-to-day lives. With coffee culture being such a big part of people's lives across the world, it might be something that we really have to consider in the future.
Thank you, Tom. An interesting story showing the true impact of climate change and how it can impact something millions and millions take for granted every day in coffee. That is all for today on the top stories of the year. Back to you, Dom and Rosa.
Thank you, Caspar. The Creative Laneways project will renovate over 40 of Melbourne's hidden and lesser-known laneways. The 6-month project is said to boost work in creative industries, where workers in that sector are among those who have been hit the hardest during the pandemic. Carissa Bossanakis reports on the latest project that will be part of Melbourne's COVID-19 recovery.
As Melbourne edges closer towards normality, a new public art project aiming to elevate the city's hidden laneways will offer much-needed job opportunities to local creatives. Through the Creative Laneways project, the Victorian Government is backing an unprecedented revitalisation of Melbourne's historic laneways. To support the artistic endeavour, the 6-month development is set to receive $7.5 million from the state government, as well as $1.4 million from the City of Melbourne. With the increase of outdoor dining to speed up Melbourne's COVID recovery, the project will help lift the decor of hospitality businesses while they transition their space to offer outdoor seating. The Working Victoria initiative aimed to employ over 150 creatives who specialise in lighting design, visual arts and music production to assist with Melbourne's new facelift. Digital graphics designer and projectionist Joel Zeker welcomes the Creative Laneways project but acknowledges there's a long way to go for artists to feel financially supported.
So the opportunity for art to exist is great. Giving over spaces, that's fantastic. But that doesn't solve the problem of giving people the lifelong careers in the arts.
While grappling with the lack of opportunities for local creatives, Joel finds the existing support packages aren't enough to suffice those out of work.
We're applying for things and then hearing back that, 1,200 people applied. And that's great to know that artists are ready to go and that they're really positive. There's virtually no chance of you getting a lot of these grants.
Award-winning theatrical and architectural lighting designer John Ford and artistic director Katerina Kokonos-Kennedy are longtime collaborators of Triage Live Art Collective. While many artist relief packages have been announced, eligibility is often limited, John and Katerina say, making it almost impossible for artists to qualify for governmental support.
Unfortunately, there's a bit of a line in the sand with current policies around making it too difficult for artists to benefit.
They're sort of packaged as a sort of competitive thing in the way that most arts funding is, which is in a sense not what's required at the moment.
And with a decrease in funding for the arts revealed in the proposed federal budget, the sector is sure to feel the lasting effects of the pandemic for quite some time. Reporting for RMIT Newsline, I'm Carissa Bossanakis.
New South Wales are changing their COVID restrictions to allow more space for community music to continue to practice and perform. Reporter Neve Wilton speaks with Matt Kloss from RMIT, which provides insights to the New South Wales government on how to best ease restrictions impacting the music industry.
Hi Matt, thanks for speaking with us today. Your work with the New South Wales has been successful. What changes are coming to help the community music and how are you going to bring this success to Victoria?
Well, we've formed a historic roundtable called RMIT in New South Wales to work collaboratively with government, in particular with New South Wales Health, to advise and work on a plan to bring back music into community and schools. And that's worked very well with major announcements as recently as yesterday, allowing up to 500 people to be at an outdoor concert in New South Wales. And we're hoping I've been asked to advise and provide some guidance into a very newly formed body in Victoria who don't want to reinvent the wheel. They really want to piggyback on what we've done in New South Wales and follow the same progression through to build that collaboration with state government for a plan and a working model so that we can roll out music back into schools and community.
Yep, and Victoria at the moment is a waiting game. Are you expecting there to be any roadblocks in the next couple of weeks?
Well, the biggest roadblock of all, of course, is uncontrolled community transmission. It's been a daily thing that we've all had to be aware of right across Australia. It certainly has been something that has affected the rollout and the timing of decisions and releasing of restrictions in New South Wales. And I expect that to be the major hurdle that has to be overcome in Victoria, of course.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, Matt, for chatting with us. That's been really insightful. Back to Rosa and Dom in the studio.
Thanks, Neve. And now to finance. The Australian share market started the day in the red due to a weak lead on Wall Street. The ASX dipped by 0.3% to 6,178, spelling the end of a 7-session streak of gains. The Dow Jones Industrial 157 points after bad news on the COVID-19 vaccine front, and little progress on a fiscal stimulus plan in Washington. Those concerns also ended a 4-day winning streak for the S&P 500. The Aussie dollar will get you 72 US cents, 61 euro cents, 55 British pence, and 75 Japanese yen. In the commodities market, gold is worth 1,896 an ounce, and oil prices have decreased only slightly. And that's the latest finance news.
Now to weather from Melbourne and around the country. We had a partly cloudy day in Melbourne today, with the chance of thunderstorms in the northwest suburbs tonight. The city reached a top of 24 degrees. Around the rest of the country, Darwin was sunny today, reaching a max of 34. Brisbane hit a top of 20. Sydney was cloudy and 24 degrees. And Canberra was much the same, 22 degrees. On the west coast, Perth was partially cloudy with a top of 25, and Broome was sunny and warm, 24 degrees. Moving south, Adelaide was mostly sunny and 21 degrees, and in Hobart, slightly cooler, 19 degrees. For the week, Melbourne is looking cloudy with scattered showers. Thursday, clouds and rain, 25 degrees. Showers on Friday, a top of 19 degrees. And to begin the week, 16 degrees on Monday and 17 on Tuesday. And that concludes today's report. Thank you for joining us on Newsline. I'm Rosa Ritchie.
And I'm Dom Hennequin. We'll be back on air with you tomorrow, and see you then. Have a great night.